Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Focus on Fellowships. I'm Dr. Ericka Boone, Director of the NIH Division of Biomedical Research Workforce. In part one of our Focus on Fellowship series, we welcome Dr. Allison Gammy from NIGMS to discuss the goals of the NIH's fellowship programs and share practical tips for finding and applying to fellowship opportunities. Today we're at part two, and we're going to discuss the ins and the outs of the fellowship application form itself from the perspective of the fellowship candidate. I am joined today by Dr. Lystranne Maynard-Smith, a scientific review officer and reviewer training coordinator at the NIH Center for Scientific Review, or CSR. Welcome, Lystranne. We have a lot to talk about today. But before we begin, tell us a little bit more about your experience and role with dealing with fellowships here at the NIH.
Hi, Erica. Glad to be here speaking about fellowships. At CSR, I've run several fellowship review panels. I was also involved with the CSR Advisory Council work group on fellowships, and I'm currently part of the Fellowship Implementation Committee, helping to bring these new changes out to everyone in the scientific community with the new revised fellowship review criteria.
Well, we're really lucky to have you here with us today because we're going to be discussing the fellowship application from the perspective of the candidate, where to find the application materials, sections within the application, and other considerations from the perspective of the candidate. Now, before we get started, can you please define for our audience who is the candidate?
I'm sure a lot of viewers are asking that question. The candidate is the individual who will conduct the research training described in the application, typically the student or trainee. As with most NIH awards, the university is technically the applicant.
Okay. So as we'll discuss later, the application instructions discuss both the candidate and the sponsor. Who is the sponsor?
The sponsor is the principal investigator who's closely involved with the candidate's research training, and that's usually their research mentor or supervisor. As you mentioned, the candidate and sponsor terms are used throughout the application instructions. That's to help clarify who's responsible for each of the application sections.
Thank you, Lystranne. Now, this provides a really good segue. Now that we know who's involved in the development of this application, the candidate and the sponsor, where can candidates find instructions for each individual that is taking part in the completion of the fellowship application?
Instructions for each NIH grant program are available through the Grants and Funding Site application guide. There you can find full instructions for every NIH grant program, including fellowships. The fellowship instructions apply to all grant applications that use the SF424 application package, and candidates should be sure that they are using the form's version I instructions. Now, the full set of instructions may seem long, but they do provide a comprehensive explanation of every part of the application. For fellowships, we'll focus on the PHS Fellowship Supplemental Form, as it includes many of the fellowship-specific forms our viewers are probably interested in. Navigating there, candidates can find information about each required application form. For example, the required statements on the candidate's goals, preparedness, and potential. The instructions will explain in detail who is expected to prepare each section, whether it's the candidate or the sponsor. It will explain the format and page limits, as well as the expected content.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of instructions that are required to submit an application, and that people should read all of these instructions carefully. And with that, making sure that they are using the most recent set of instructions for their submission is going to be absolutely important. And currently right now, those instructions are version I. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely, Erica. We will be using version forms I And the instructions may seem long, but they are meant to clearly explain every form and section that goes into the application.
Alrighty, thank you so much for that. So you mentioned application forms. So what do you mean by forms as related to the fellowship application?
The application forms are the fields the candidates and the sponsors will need to complete and submit with their application. So some forms will collect general information about the candidate, the organization, and so on. And other forms, like those in the PHS Fellowship Supplemental Form, will ask for specific information about the proposed training project, the candidate, and the sponsor.
Okay, so let's halt for a moment of clarification here. So the research project and personal statements are all a part of the PHS Fellowship Supplemental Form. Is this correct?
Yes, that's right. Those are all attachments candidates will include as part of the form.
Okay, so we'll be discussing forms and attachments throughout the Focus on Fellowship video series, so I'm glad we're covering the application structure right now. So now that we've discussed the application instructions and the organizations, let's talk more about the parts of the application itself.
Absolutely. The PHS Fellowship Supplemental Form has 8 separate sections.
So eight
Yes.
sections. Okay.
Yes, a lot of sections. So 8 sections. An application needs to include forms for each section in order to be considered for funding. But among them, there are 3 that the candidate is specifically responsible for: the candidate section, the research training plan, and the candidate biosketch. As I mentioned, the application instructions will clearly explain who should be responsible for each section.
Okay, moment of clarity. So there are sections that the candidate should be responsible for completing and the sponsor should be responsible for completing, but the candidate should always work in close connection with their sponsor for the completion of the entire application. So the candidate does not need to be an island working in isolation. Alrighty, gotcha.
Yes,
All right,
absolutely, that's correct.
Alrighty, so now that we got that straight, let's start with the candidate section. So what's required of the candidate here in the candidate section?
The candidate section asks the candidate for answers to 4 questions meant to describe their training and career goals, their educational, professional, and scientific preparation, their self-assessed strengths and areas for growth, and their perspective on their chosen scientific field. And now, although the candidate is responsible for preparing the candidate section, I definitely encourage them to discuss each of the questions with their mentor. We do not want them to be in isolation while they're preparing the application, and so definitely encourage them to discuss each of these questions with their sponsor/mentor.
Thank you for that reminder again, because these are critical parts of the application. So can you talk a little bit more about what candidates should be providing in each of these sections? This is kind of new for Forms I, right? So I'm sure that most of the people that are viewing us today really want to know, how do I put my best foot forward and what should I be including in these sections, including the candidate section?
Yes, absolutely. So for the first section, the overall training goals section, this asks the candidates to provide a description of their proposed research training plan and long-term goals for a career in biomedical research, their motivation for that career path, and the link between their fellowship goals and their long-term career goals. The next section, candidate preparedness, asks candidates to share how their educational, scientific, and professional experience prepare them for the fellowship project. They can highlight relevant coursework, research experiences, conferences, internships, and employment.
Alrighty, so what about non-academic or professional activities?
Absolutely. Experiences that demonstrate their interests, such as skill development, leadership activities, teaching outreach, or other public service, are relevant activities to explain here. The self-assessment section, the next section, candidates are given an opportunity to highlight some of their strengths and areas for development that are likely to contribute to their success during the fellowship and in their career path. They should share 2 to 4 characteristics that will contribute to their success in the research training project, as well as 2 to 4 areas for development. So examples could be technical skills, operational skills that they could use in the lab, or professional skills, which is something that would be skills that they would use outside of the lab. Maybe it's a networking conference or seminar or workshop, but they should use all of the areas of development, what they've done, what experience have they had, and use that within their fellowship application. The last one is the scientific perspective section, which is where we ask the candidates to explain why their field of science is important and how their project contributes, as well as discuss a broader unresolved scientific question in the field and how biomedical research may advance it.
So it sounds like in the scientific perspective section that candidates are really being asked to flex their scientific understanding and provide their unique perspective on their science.
That's exactly right, Ericka.
Okay, so speaking of scientific understanding, can you tell us more or talk more about the research training plan and the research project that the candidate is proposing to conduct during their training period? What should candidates be considering to include in this section as they're preparing to develop it?
Yes, the research training plan is a critical component of the fellowship application. Candidates should be leading the development of the sections within the research training plan, starting with the training activities and timeline. Here, they should describe the planned activities that are meant to address their goals and areas for development. They should discuss the amount of time they plan to dedicate to these different activities, how the proposed activities contribute to the areas identified in the candidate section, specific examples of how the proposed research training will help them advance to their next career stage, and how the research environment will support their proposed research training.
So you mentioned that the candidate should be leading the development of the research training plan form section, but I wanted to interject yet again for a moment of clarification. So candidates are expected to be conferring and working in close collaboration with others, including their sponsor, throughout this process, correct?
Absolutely. The research training plan should reflect the candidate's own thoughts and goals, but they are always welcome and encouraged to work with their sponsors and their collaborators and mentors throughout the writing process.
Alrighty, thank you so much for participating in that moment of clarification. So now that we've discussed the training activities and the timeline, I'm sure that viewers want to know about the project aims as well as the strategy. So can you talk more about those sections?
Absolutely. The specific aims section is a one-page synopsis of the proposed training project and should concisely state the goals of the training research project, outline the objectives and scientific aims, and also summarize the expected outcomes. Now, the scientific aims page can be a real challenge for scientists of any career stage, but it's your first and best opportunity to communicate the importance of the proposed research, making it a critical part of the application.
All right, time out once again for a moment of clarification. So if the aims are only one page long, when will the candidate have the opportunity to discuss the details of their proposed project?
That's in the next section, the research training project strategy. It's here that the candidate will discuss the scientific basis of the proposed project. They should provide scientific context, the rationale for the proposed research training activities, and the bigger picture for how the project will advance research in the field. It's also in this section that candidates will discuss the scientific approach. There they should explain the overall strategy, methodology, and analyses that will be used. They should also discuss potential pitfalls, alternative approaches, and predicted outcomes, as well as realistic scientific benchmarks. And they should also discuss how biological variables will be considered and address any potential hazardous materials or procedures. Also, if the candidate is proposed to gain clinical trial experience, this would be the place to discuss their role in that work as well.
In our most recent episode of Focus on Fellowships, we gave a general overview of the recent changes to the fellowship application. Did those changes affect the specific aims or the research strategy attachments as well?
Good question. And the answer is no. The aims and strategy sections were not significantly affected by the changes. In this case, candidates may be able to use past applications as examples for preparing these sections.
Okay, so there's some continuity that people can map onto between the old version and the newest version, in this case, Forms I for fellowship applications. So that's great. But are there other attachments that are included in the research training project section?
In the rare case that the submission is for a renewal application, this is where candidates would report progress or publications. If this applies, it may be best to reach out to a program official before submitting.
Well, okay, yet again, let's pause for another moment of clarification. Candidates can reach out to program officers to ask questions. Is that true?
Absolutely true, and we encourage them to reach out to NIH staff to answer any questions that they may have as they're preparing their application.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to keep hearing this over and over again on Focus on Fellowships. Please reach out, please reach out, please reach out. Thank you. Please continue.
Lastly, the candidate should address their organization's training in the responsible conduct of research. The responsible conduct of research is something NIH takes very seriously. It's fine if this content is taken from the organizational course descriptions, but it is important that candidates understand the content and training from this course.
So it's not just the research that candidates are proposing, but it's actually how the research is conducted.
Absolutely, and this is part of their training. Responsible conduct of research is critical to good science.
Absolutely. So now we've covered the research training plan section. I want to come back to something that you called a biosketch. For those individuals that are not familiar, what is said biosketch, and what should candidates be expected to include in the biosketch?
The biosketch, or biographical sketch, is like a curriculum vitae or CV. Candidates should provide basic information like their ERA Commons username, details on their positions, scientific appointments, and any honors and contributions to science, for example, publications. We realize that candidates may not have many honors to share, but they're encouraged to mention any positions, scholarships, traineeships, or awards that may be relevant.
I don't think that I heard you mention grades.
Good catch. Grades are no longer allowed in candidate biosketches. That's part of our effort to level the playing field, so to speak, and help identify promising candidates without relying on narrow markers of academic success only.
All right, that's great to hear. So is there anything else that candidates need to remember when they are preparing their fellowship application? We're looking for some real gems here.
Candidates are required to submit several reference letters as part of their application. Those letters should come from individuals not directly involved with the application, but who are familiar with the applicant's qualifications. Reference letter instructions were updated in late 2024, so it's probably a good idea to send the most updated guidance to any reference letter writers well in advance of the application due date.
So let's pause one last time for a moment of clarification. I'm asked often by potential applicants about who they should ask to provide a letter of reference. So I hear all the time, well, I can ask X professor to do it. He's really famous in my department and in the field, but he doesn't know me very well. So would a candidate be better off with, I guess, asking a well-known scientist that doesn't really know them to provide a letter of reference, or someone who really does know who they are, knows more about their skills, their goals, etc., but may not necessarily be that famous scientist in their area?
Good question. And the answer is definitely the latter. You want your reference letter writer to be someone who really understands you, the candidate. They know your background. They know how you've prepared for this fellowship. They know what your goals are, and they could also probably speak to how the fellowship links to your long-term career goals. So we're not focused on, the fame of the reference letter writer. We are more interested in the content and how the content describes you, the candidate, and how this fellowship would actually benefit your long-term career goals. And you will only get that from someone who actually knows you and knows your journey.
Okay, so quality over reputation or perceived reputation wins every time. Thank you so much for that point. So, Lystranne, this has been such an informative conversation. Now, before I let you go, are there any final reminders that you'd like for viewers to be left with?
I'll leave with 2 points. First, candidates should consider applying even if they don't think of themselves as a classic competitive candidate. Omitting grades from the Biosketch and other changes to the application are meant to really help NIH identify the most promising candidates while reducing the reliance on past academic achievement, on the sponsor, or on the institutional reputation. Second point would be, it's really important to remember that NIH made significant changes to fellowship applications, so it's critical that candidates carefully read the application instructions and the funding opportunity. You won't be able to repurpose some content from old applications with these new changes. And as I said a few times, candidates can always reach out to NIH staff with questions about the application process.
So, Lystranne, this has really been an informative conversation. I thank you so much for being here. We have had the opportunity to discuss several important topics that are intended to give candidates a chance to discuss their strengths, their goals, and their perspectives as it pertains to the fellowship application. We have also discussed the parts of the research training plan, and we've discussed the Biosketch and reference letters. Whew, there's so much that we've talked about today, but it is my hope that prospective candidates watching today feel just a bit more prepared to submit their fellowship application at the next submission deadline. Thank you so very much for joining me today. It's always good to see you, to talk to you, and share with you.
Of course, happy to help. Thanks for inviting me on, and good luck to all of the prospective candidates.
Lystranne, thank you once again for joining us, and thank you to you all out there for joining us for another episode of Focus on Fellowships. For more information on NIH fellowships and NIH's other grant programs, follow us on LinkedIn, on X, YouTube, and listen to the All About Grants podcast. You can also visit us on grants.gov to explore NIH's funding opportunities, and visit the NIH Grants and Funding site for more on NIH's various training and career development programs. Please join us next time as we discuss the fellowship peer review process. Take care.